Humphrey was this great, among other things, legislative wizard. And that used to be a term that people would use. Sam Rayburn was a legislative wizard. Johnson was a legislative wizard. Teddy Kennedy, Harry Reid, Bob Dole. And it's not a word people use anymore. And I don't think that's because there's nobody in the Congress who has that ambition. It's because it's not possible anymore. It used to be possible because members of both parties were prepared to compromise. They were prepared to do what needed to be done in order to pass legislation that they cared about. And we're now in a situation where that's so unthinkable that when something has to get done in a bipartisan way, people will meet in private, and you'll hear about the gang of something, the gang of 8, the gang of 14, whatever it is, who are meeting in some room somewhere, and nobody should see them because they'll be so punished for partisan disloyalty if they do that. And so now, the Congress, if it can keep itself running, if it can keep the government running, it's done something. That's basically what it's been reduced to. And that's really a catastrophe for a democracy. Not only because, of course, you want the government to do things, and they can't do it unless the Congress does, but a legislature is a deliberative body, and democracies depend on deliberation. There are all sorts of political philosophers who will tell you that deliberation is the core of democracy. And so we now have, in effect, a kind of non-deliberative democracy. And the question of how we get back to that is a separate question, which I won't address now. I write a little Substack, and this was actually the subject of my last post of earlier this week. And so I don't read this passage just out of nostalgia, but out of a need or a wish to remind people that this kind of thing was taken for granted. It's what a congressman did, and that's gone now. So just a few words of background about how the Civil Rights Act and Hubert came to be connected to each other before I actually read the passage in question. So Humphrey was, of course, a great champion of civil rights as mayor of Minneapolis at the 1948 Democratic Convention and when he came to the Senate. But there was very little to be done about that legislatively. It wasn't really possible. So every year or every new term, Humphrey would propose a package of 6 bills for civil rights, and nothing would happen to them. But all this time in the Senate, starting in 1949, he had also apprenticed himself to Lyndon Johnson. And it's a big part of my book, and it's a very important part of Humphrey's life. The other liberals hated Johnson. They feared him, they distrusted him, and some hated him, because they thought that he was just another one of these Southern racists. And Hubert, A, believed that Johnson had the seed of liberalism in him, but B, he wanted to know how to do this thing. So Hubert arrived in the Senate as a great speaker. He had been a debater in high school. He was just a world champion talker and a persuader. And he was passionate about it, and he was brilliant about it. He was a great talker. He did not know how to legislate. Johnson was not a talker. Johnson had no interest in giving speeches, couldn't give a speech, and almost never gave a good speech. But he knew how to get this vote and that vote and this vote and that vote. And he knew how to use the rules. And Humphrey, unlike the other great liberals who were in the Senate, Paul Douglas, Harriman, people like that, who shunned all that stuff and gave beautiful speeches and accomplished nothing, Humphrey really went to school at the Lyndon Johnson Academy and learned at Johnson's side for years how to do the things he didn't know how to do. And it's always struck me as a kind of sad fact that Johnson was unable to learn from Humphrey what he, Johnson, didn't know. Because Johnson knew the inside game, and Humphrey knew the outside game. And Humphrey learned the inside game from Johnson, and Johnson never learned the outside game from Humphrey. So finally, of course, John Kennedy becomes president. Oh, thanks for coming. You haven't missed anything yet. So Kennedy becomes president, and Humphrey urges him to pass civil rights legislation. Kennedy at first has no interest in doing it. He thinks that's a loser. The Southerners in the Democratic Party will kill it. And then the civil rights movement happens. Birmingham happens. And the Kennedys under increasing pressure. And so finally in the fall of '63, in September of '63, he actually introduces to Congress for real civil rights legislation, which he hadn't done before. Of course, Kennedy is assassinated in November of '63. Johnson becomes president. And Johnson is determined from the outset that he is going to pass civil rights legislation. I mean, to a remarkable degree, he had been harboring this inside himself, and when he becomes president, he says, this is what I will do. And so in February of '64, the House, which is much more liberal than the Senate, passes bold, dramatic civil rights legislation, which essentially consists of all the things Humphrey's been proposing for all these years and getting nowhere. And so once it's passed in the House, then Humphrey's moment arrives. So I'm going to start from there. Here, let's see. Okay, so it's February of '64. The House passes what's called H.R. 7152. Congressmen had added as Title VII the all-important employment discrimination provision that Kennedy had resisted. Humphrey had been pushing for a Fair Employment Practices Commission. Kennedy had said, absolutely not, that's a bridge too far. It's now part of the legislation. The other 6 parts, so there's 7 parts of the Civil Rights Bill, the other 6 parts strengthened voting rights in federal elections, outlawed segregation in public facilities, authorized the Attorney General to sue to stop discrimination in those facilities, and to enforce school desegregation orders, extended the life of the Civil Service Commission, and mandated a cutoff of federal funds where discrimination was found. So everything. This is what people have been dreaming of for a generation, and everything was in this bill. Humphrey understood that the great test of his life now lay before him. As he later wrote in a memo recapping the whole experience, I had to make up my mind as to mental attitude and how I would conduct myself. I can recall literally talking to myself, conditioning myself for the long ordeal. He would not lose his temper, no matter how much he was provoked by the forces of Jim Crow. He would not get distracted. Humphrey cleared his schedule so that he could be on the floor for hours each day and available almost every other waking moment. Johnson, endlessly goading, called Humphrey to say, "You've got this opportunity now, Hubert, but you liberals will never deliver. You don't know the rules of the Senate, and your liberals will be off making speeches when they ought to be present in the Senate." But Humphrey would not repeat this mistake. For years, he had watched Richard Russell. So Richard Russell was the champion of the Southern forces, this great figure, but an arch segregationist. He had watched Richard Russell outflank the liberals. This time, he would overcome liberal individualism to infuse a spirit of discipline and teamwork in the ranks. One of Russell's great tricks was to filibuster until the other side drifted off and then call for a quorum. If the quorum call failed, the session would be adjourned. Humphrey appointed a rotating team of 4 captains to remain on the floor at all times. They would alert their colleagues to assemble the moment a quorum was called. Humphrey appointed another set of captains to master each of the bill's titles and to defend them from Southern attack. But Humphrey understood that unlike Russell, whose negative goal of blocking legislation depended upon internal discipline, he needed to marshal the public to put pressure on the fence-sitters. Humphrey's deep ties to activists, which Johnson had always ridiculed, proved invaluable. he met with religious leaders and labor leaders to plan a massive lobbying campaign at the national, state, and local levels. He published a daily newsletter written by staff members and sometimes legal scholars. Humphrey and his team convened every morning 30 minutes before the start of the day's session. Though on Mondays and Thursdays, civil rights lobbyists were permitted to join the sessions, they were not going to run the show. Staffers thought of those meetings as at least part charade, designed to keep the advocates on board. Humphrey faced excruciating difficulties on all sides. His friends in the civil rights community, who'd been sold out time after time, had every reason to fear that they'd be sold out again. On February 28th, Joe Rao and Clarence Mitchell Jr., chief lobbyist of the NAACP, came to the whip's office to plot strategy with Humphrey and Thomas Kuchel, the Republican whip and Humphrey's indispensable partner. Mitchell, who, like Humphrey, essentially would not leave Capitol Hill for the next 3+ months, called for an open campaign of pressure against the fence-sitters, including an order to the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms to arrest members who failed to appear for a quorum call. Humphrey and Kuchel knew this would backfire. Humphrey implored Rao and Mitchell to ease off the pressure and refused to put his colleagues in the hoosegow, but also promised that he would not permit the bill to be weakened. The two agreed uneasily. On March 9th, Mike Mansfield is the Senate Majority Leader. And by the way, I should add here something I should have said before, which is that when a bill comes out of committee and then proceeds to the full House or the full Senate, the rule was always that the mastermind of the bill would be the committee chairman who saw it through committee. Now, that couldn't happen in this case. They had bypassed the committee because all the important committees were controlled by the South. The Senate Judiciary Committee, which would have normally heard this bill, was controlled by James Eastland, arch segregationist from Mississippi. And so the question was, who would be responsible for the bill? And Mansfield could have been that person, but Mansfield was not a person who enjoyed all of this legerdemain. Johnson knew that Humphrey was the person, and it was really Johnson. Well, Johnson and Mansfield had agreed, but Johnson insisted that it be Humphrey. So it was Humphrey. He was the person who was responsible. Okay, so on March 9th, Mike Mansfield introduced H.R. 7152. Immediately, Richard Russell's troops launched into a filibuster to prevent the bill from being debated. Here, Humphrey made another strategic decision. He and his lieutenants, rather than waiting for the Southerners to run out of steam, would actively argue with them. On the 10th, Humphrey dueled with Senator Stennis, another member of the Southern group of Jim Crow senators. Dueled with Senator Stennis over the reach of the 14th Amendment, which Stennis insisted, incredibly, did not apply to local ordinances enforcing segregation. The next day, Humphrey goaded Allen Ellender of Louisiana into a remarkable confession. I'm frank to admit that in many, I'm going to not do the Southern accent. I'm frank to admit that in many cases, the reason why the voting rights were not encouraged is that the white people in those counties who are in the minority are afraid they'd be outvoted. Rightly so, he added. They were scared to death to have Negroes in public office without qualifications. This was catnip for the national press. So too, a mid-March debate with Russell on the Today Show, in which the latter described Title II on public accommodations as, quote, a serious invasion of the right of private property. Do you mean, shot back a faux incredulous Humphrey, that, quote, we permit people to come into public accommodations that are dope addicts so long as they're white, but not, quote, a decent, wholesome citizen who happens to be black? Humphrey was making the case for common decency. The Southerners were obliging by saying what people said to one another in Selma or Biloxi, but not in Lincoln, Nebraska. The filibuster was holding perfectly well But Russell began to worry that he was losing in the court of public opinion, which had turned decisively against him in the aftermath of Birmingham and the spreading protests against the denial of voting rights and of access to restaurants and bus terminals. He passed the word to Mansfield that he was prepared to hold a vote to make the Civil Rights Bill the Senate's pending business. So that's a legislative technique, meaning, okay, this is what we're talking about. On March 26th, the Senate voted 67-15 to do so. Humphrey took this opportunity to make the affirmative case for the legislation. From March 30th through mid-April, he and his captains explained the bill title by title. This gave Democrats such as Joseph Clark and Philip Hart, and also Republicans such as Roman Hruska and Gordon Allott of Colorado, a chance to enjoy both the Senate spotlight and the media attention that came with it. Humphrey himself kicked off this public seminar with a 3-hour speech introducing the whole bill. He explained the rationale for Title I, which mandated uniform standards for voter registration. By ticking off a list of southern counties where blacks outnumbered whites, but none, 0, had been allowed to register. In the case of Title II, access to public facilities, he observed that while the popular travel guide for people with pets included many hotels and restaurants where they'd be welcome, a guide published for black motorists showed no place at all in many of those citizens where they could dine or stay. 10 years after the Brown decision, he noted in regard to Title IV, no black children were attending school alongside whites in the South. It is, Humphrey observed, nothing short of amazing that the American Negro has been so patient, a sharp reminder to Americans who bristled at illegal sit-ins. Russell began deploying his weapons. On April 4th, a Saturday, one of his lieutenants issued a quorum call. Only 39 of the 51 needed senators answered. Humphrey was furious and publicized the names of the absentees. On the 13th, opening day for the Washington Senators baseball team, and thus an undeclared holiday for Congress, Spessard Holland of Florida called for a quorum, a low blow. Humphrey, at the game, had the announcer page members and sent limousines to pick them up. This time, they mustered a majority. Never again, during the debate, would the bill's supporters fail to meet a quorum. So, okay, he had solved that problem. Now, for the next month or two, much of what happened was private negotiations between Humphrey and his team and Everett Dirksen. Everett Dirksen was the Republican leader, senator from Illinois, a Republican, but a conservative, but not a Southerner, not an unreasonable man. He had many concerns. So a lot of what happened outside of public view. And so here Humphrey and his team were, and members of the Justice Department, were working with Dirksen in order to satisfy his concerns, which they ultimately succeeded in doing. So you can see how many levels he's working on at once. So we now come to the vote for cloture, the vote to end debate, which requires 2/3 of the senators, 67 of the 100 senators. The cloture vote looked like it would be agonizingly close. A May 26th tally by the Associated Press found only 56 definite votes to end the filibuster. Humphrey activated the lobby of heaven. Ministers, priests, and even bishops began to badger their local senators. Johnson promised Carl Hayden, an Arizona Democrat who had never cast a cloture vote in over 37 years in the Senate, that he would deliver a Central Arizona water project if Hayden would vote to end the filibuster. By June 9th, Humphrey knew he had the votes, but he stayed in the office beyond midnight, calling colleagues and keeping a running tally. He called Johnson to say he crossed the threshold. "How are you counting Hayden?" Johnson asked. "How many Republicans is Dirksen going to deliver?" Humphrey stood firm. He had 68 and counting. Humphrey went back to work, calling and tallying. By the time he was done, well past midnight, he picked up J. Howard Edmondson, an Oklahoma Democrat, as well as 2 Republicans, Carl Curtis of Nebraska and John Williams of Delaware. At 11 o'clock the next morning, the hour appointed for the cloture vote, each side was first given 30 minutes to speak. So the Republicans speak, and then Mike Mansfield speaks actually very, very eloquently. Mansfield then yielded 2 minutes to Humphrey, who wore a red rose in his lapel. 3 months of round-the-clock work and infrequent meals had burned away the flab he had put on over the years. He weighed 20 pounds less than he had in March. Ebullient, on the edge of the great legislative triumph of his life, Humphrey quoted the words that Shakespeare put into the mouth of Henry V at Agincourt. "You will be able to tell your children that you were here on this day." And then the question was put: is it the sense of the Senate that the debate should be brought to a close? The clerk read out the roll in almost perfect silence. The newsman, Roger Mudd, receiving word from a reporter inside the hall, ticked off each vote for a nationwide audience. Claire Engel of California, dying of a brain tumor, was wheeled into the chamber, where he had not appeared in months. Engel tried, but failed, to raise his arm. Instead, he pointed to his eye, and the clerk called aye. When John Williams of Delaware cast the 67th vote, Humphrey threw his arms over his head in triumph. In the end, 71 senators voted for cloture. The first time in history the body had ended a filibuster over civil rights by vote. On June 19th, the Civil Rights Bill passed the Senate, 73 to 27. On July 2nd, the House passed the amended legislation, and President Johnson signed it on a live television broadcast. The greatest breakthrough on civil rights since the end of Reconstruction had many fathers. The fearless protesters who had stood up to Bull Connor and his fire hoses and attack dogs. Johnson, Dirksen, and congressmen such as William McCulloch, Mitchell and Rao and Wilkins, the head of the NAACP. Churchmen and labor leaders. But it was Hubert Humphrey who had defeated the South. Congressional Quarterly ascribed the victory to Humphrey's masterful day-in and day-out perseverance, and sharply contrasted his organization, patience, and good humor to Russell's intransigent failure to find compromise when and where it might have been possible. At no point had Humphrey violated his own gentlemanly code. The South had no reason to feel ill-treated. It's in fact remarkable to see how often his opponents lavished praise on him, even in the midst of bitter disputes. At one point, when Russell Long implored Humphrey to give the other side a chance to talk, John McClellan of Arkansas, an ardent segregationist who had in fact been waiting to speak, blurted out, "I'm in favor of his speaking daily, repeatedly, and thereafter, because he's always helpful and always informative, even if we do not agree with him." Hubert Humphrey, who worried so much about falling short of the high standards set for him by his father, must have known how very proud Hubert Humphrey Sr. would have been. So, that was the age of heroism of legislation. Well, thank you. So, I'm eager for any questions that anybody has about either this or anything else that has to do with Hubert. Yes.
So thank you for that, and I had a chance to start reading it, and so just by chance, I thought, well, I'll flip through a couple chapters before I come tonight. And right after that, then you talk about what happened at the convention with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Right.
And I can't remember exactly how you describe it, but everything that happened there. So he goes from that unbelievably high note at the end in June to a large part then of the civil rights movement, viewing him as, is it Fannie Lou Hamer that famously says, "Great, get to be vice president, but you sold everybody out. And so I would be interested in sort of hearing a little more about the contrast and how you think about that, and Humphrey, you know.
So, I think that, well, there's several things.
Yeah.
One is, so Humphrey had grown up with the civil rights movement. These guys all knew him, he knew them, they were very close. But who were those people? The civil rights movement in the 1950s meant guys like Humphrey, except they were black. They were lawyers, they were extremely well educated, they were completely habituated to the ways of Congress, and they were weighing in on legislation. They would sit together and confabulate over this. And so it was very easy for people like Hubert to feel profoundly comfortable. So then the civil rights movement begins in the streets and not in Congress. And so again, for Humphrey, the civil rights people who suffered at the lunch counters of Greensboro, North Carolina, who marched in Birmingham, this was very noble and heroic. And again, he was very moved by this. The March in Washington, 1963, the summer of '63, to him was the apogee of all this. And he talked about about the spirit of peace and civility, so that when a bunch of Minnesota farmers in their coveralls tried to move forward to hear better, people parted out of the way, and that atmosphere, that was the moment that he believed in. Well, he didn't know anything about the South. He didn't understand. I mean, he understood but didn't feel, didn't know. The rage people felt about generations of second-class citizenship. And so the civil rights movement itself its leadership began to move from those guys in dark suits in Congress to ordinary people down south. Fannie Lou Hamer was the supreme example, a woman who had no education but just immense inner dignity, who had endured terrible beatings in order to register to vote, who lost her job, who risked everything. And so, without going into the whole story, the civil rights movement, SNCC, essentially formed a rival party in Mississippi. The Mississippi Democratic Party was all white. No black was ever allowed to even attend a meeting, much less be part of it. So they formed their own multiracial party. And they did all the right things they were supposed to do. They were advised by lawyers, they registered people, they held votes and so on, and they created their own separate delegate slate. And they came to Atlantic City to challenge the racist Democratic Party of Mississippi. And so this became an immense battle. Humphrey had not yet been chosen as vice president by LBJ, and that was on purpose. LBJ wanted to keep using Humphrey. First of all, he loved the idea. He just loved torturing. He was an absolutely sadistic person. But he also wanted to use Humphrey, and so he said to Humphrey, you could talk to those people, you know those people, solve it. And so Johnson had deployed all sorts of people. Walter Reuther, the great labor leader, Humphrey, others, solve it. And so what you had described were these terrible, painful, bitter meetings where these incredibly brave people who had come to Atlantic City to assert their rights, finally, were being told by these liberal Democrats, including Hubert Humphrey, the great champion of civil rights, you can't do that. You can't do that, because if you do that, then Mississippi will bolt and the other southern states will bolt, and who knows what's going to happen. And above all, Johnson said you can't do it. And Humphrey believed, perhaps rightly, that if he didn't solve the problem, he wasn't going to be made vice president. If he wasn't going to be made vice president, he'd never be president, because that's the only way it was going to happen. Lyndon Johnson had just become president by being vice president. And so he had to do this incredibly ugly thing and basically say to them, we're not going to see you. We're going to find some compromise, and you're going to have to accept it. And so the compromise was two members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who we're going to choose. We're going to tell you which two are going to become, in effect, ad hoc members. And then the rest of the party is going to be seated like that. Well, this caused outrage. And I think many historians of the civil rights movement will say that that moment in Atlantic City was a decisive moment in the breaking of what until then had been an extreme, tremendous sense of amity, tremendous interracial harmony between white and black civil rights leaders. And there were quite a few people that day, black civil rights leaders, who said, I've had it with these people. I'm not going to play ball with it anymore. And Fannie Lou Hamer, as you said, denounced him. Now, what should he have done? I don't know. It's hard to say, but it's just, you look back and see, it's a tragic moment. It had very deep roots.
I think you started down this path, but what is it that caused you to write?
What is, I'm sorry,
I say, I think you started down this
Yeah.
path when you began, but what is it that caused you to write
Oh.
about Hubert Humphrey?
Ah.
Title it this, In This Day.
yeah, so I had written an earlier book called What is Liberalism? And so, I mean, the short answer to all these questions is two words, Donald Trump. And so, you know, when Trump won, I was like all sorts of other bewildered liberals who just assumed it wouldn't happen because America would never choose such a person. You know, and like a lot of other people, I realized I didn't get what was going on in this country. And so that really changed my sense of what I should be writing about. I really was thought of as a foreign policy person for many years before then. That's what I wrote about. And I thought, you know, I'm getting on planes and going to interesting places, and I don't know what's going on in my own country. And so the first thing I did was write this book about this idea, this word liberalism, which is a word I was brought up in. I'm of an age where, you know, all right-thinking people were liberals. And then, when I was thinking about what I was going to do next, I wasn't really sure, and when you in between books, you're always kind of desperately trying to figure out what's next. Hubert had a role in my liberalism book, because he's this kind of figure who incarnates mid-20th century American liberalism. And I thought, he's a great story. He's a great story. People don't know that in 1948 he gave this great speech at the Democratic Convention, which put civil rights on the agenda of the Democratic Party. There have been perfectly good biographies written about him, but kind of not from my point of view of trying to think through what this mid-20th century liberalism thing was all about. So that was why.
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah. Kara, were you going to ask something?
So, sort of a follow-up to this.
I should say Kara Walker was my indispensable research assistant on this book.
It's a real pleasure. Got to dive deep into the Minnesota State Archives.
Yeah.
It's fun time. Yeah. But as kind of a follow-up to this conversation about the shift in the civil rights, the direction of Humphrey's career was so interesting. It was one of those interesting things that I think I learned in helping with the research for this. Just this peak and almost fall. Do you think that this shift in the civil rights moment impacted the rest of the trajectory of his career? Or is it kind of tangential to everything?
No, it shifted, I mean, at some deep level, it shifted everything. So, I mean, I think the terrible paradox, conundrum, whatever the word is, you know, Lyndon Johnson famously said, though he didn't really say, you know, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, there goes the Solid South. He didn't say it, but he knew it. But they didn't know how deep would be the schism that civil rights legislation would cause. My belief, which I think is to some extent borne out by the polling of that time, but maybe it's just a belief, is that it wasn't the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, because I do think that a very large majority of Americans regarded this as a moment of national conscience, that it was unspeakable that we had second-class citizens in our midst. But that wasn't enough, and Johnson knew that wasn't enough. And so the Great Society, the war on poverty, was a different thing, because there was no way of doing the things you had to do that were going to finally give black people an opportunity to be equal competitors in the race for success without taking something from people, right? You don't take, when you give people the right to vote or to be in a restaurant, you don't take that right away from other people. But when you say to a union and a hiring hall, you know, you have got to start having black apprentices as electricians. Well, that means some number of white apprentices are not going to be hired. So the moment that happened, I think that's what really began the schism, and that's what began, not only in the Deep South, but in the Midwest and elsewhere, the defection of people, first to George Wallace, then to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, of course, and Donald Trump, who was the supreme reincarnation of George Wallace in all these respects. And so Humphrey's loss in '68 was not because he supported the war in Vietnam and the liberals left. The liberals came back and voted for him, pretty much. He lost because people who used to vote for Democrats, working class voters, voted for Wallace or for Nixon. And that had to do with lots of things. It had to do with crime and welfare, but all these things connected to race. So in that sense, yes. And I think Humphrey spends the last phase of his life, from the time he returns to the Senate in 1970, stays there till he dies in January of '78. And that whole part of his career, I think, was dedicated. He was always interested in 10 different things, but the central thing was, how do I solve that problem? How do we, the Democrats, find politics that speaks to the joined interests and the joined fears, he would have said, of white working class and middle class people and black working class and middle class people. So he really tried to think through a politics that had more to do with class than with race. And this is so important today because it's so much what Joe Biden, I think, is trying to do. And, you know, the Democratic activist progressive wing is deeply identitarian and wants to think about issues in identity terms. Biden has had to buy into that a little bit, but it's completely contrary to his nature. Biden would like to do the thing Humphrey was trying to do then. Gene?
So if I'm hearing you thread that division and schism back then to today in Donald Trump, and how completely polarized we are, so here we are in 24, people don't know we're gonna have democracy in 25. And where does this go?
Well, you know, so I write this newsletter, this Substack, which is about long-term solutions to our democratic erosion. One of them I wrote about was ranked choice voting, which Gene has been a great force for here in Minnesota. And so I think a lot about the long-term question. But what if we don't get to the long term? I mean, you know, this is why, you know, so many people write obsessively about, you know, should Joe Biden step down? You know, is someone else likely to win? And so I don't think you were exaggerating. I think we're at this terrifying moment where, once again, a thing we thought could not happen very much can happen. I mean, I was just having dinner with a friend who is also, he's way more plugged into the stuff than I am. And someone actually at the dinner said to him, well, what can we do? What can we do? You know, and he said, well, I know what I do, because he had just written a bunch of things saying, you know, Joe Biden should step down, and if he did, here's what would happen, and here's how I envision the process, and it would work. You know, so if the question is, how do we avert this looming catastrophe? I mean, I'm not an expert in this stuff. I don't know. I have to say, he was quite persuasive to me. I mean, this is not my subject at all, but my sense is that right now, the Joe Biden brand, quite unfairly, I think he's been a very good president. Nevertheless, his brand is more damaged, I believe, than the Democratic Party brand. And therefore, I could imagine, you know, that Thursday, I mean, it's not going to happen, you know, Thursday night, it's the State of the Union speech, and Joe Biden does the Lyndon Johnson thing of March 31st, 1968, and says, you know, I'm stepping down. And then what would happen? I don't know. You have a whole bunch of debates would suddenly, you know, there wouldn't be any primaries. It's too late for that, except maybe California. assess what happened. And we'd figure out who people like, and they would choose that person. That's not going to happen. I mean, Biden doesn't think that way. But of course, I'm just as frightened as everyone else is. Anyone else? Yes.
You spoke about liberal independence, the idea of, I'm sorry, I've lost my phrasing, about we all march to our own drummer, and that's the
Liberal
famous song.
individualism.
Liberal
Yeah.
individualism.
Yeah.
So, what are the lessons of Humphrey that we can use today, when we're so polarized, to find a path forward when we're up against people who are a party, the Republican Party, that's in lockstep or appears to at least?
Well, I may only be able to give a kind of indirect answer to that question. Humphrey's unusual because he was so idealistic and yet he was so pragmatic. That's a really unusual combination. He wasn't cynical at all, but he believed in doing what you have to do to win. I would say for a long time, Democrats suffered from nominating people who were very high-minded and deeply thoughtful about policy issues and didn't like politics particularly. I would say that's been true, as far back as, I don't know about Walter Mondale, certainly Mike Dukakis, and John Kerry and Hillary. All these people who, we all admired so much because they're really idealistic and they're really thoughtful, but they didn't actually love this politics thing, and Bill Clinton was kind of the first cure of that. Bill Clinton is in many ways the sort of classic version of what Machiavelli was talking about when he said you need to have a good man willing to act badly. And he was willing to act badly. I mean, terribly badly sometimes. But he loved getting his hands dirty. He loved doing stuff like that. Hubert was like that too. By the way, Joe Biden is like that. I mean, Biden is a very Hubert-like figure. Hubert, I think, is far more of a policy intellectual. Biden is nothing like that, Biden, basically it was like, having fun with girls when Hubert was, reading books. But he's a guy who loves the game and got in a lot of trouble with progressives because he would do deals with terrible people. Because to him, that's what politics is. And I think that is what politics is. There's another book about Humphrey that ends in 1948. This glorious moment when he brings civil rights into the mainstream. Well, it's a beautiful moment, but that's actually not what politics is mostly about. It's not mostly about heroic, romantic, beautiful, morally simple moments. And I'm much more interested. Mine is obviously a whole biography of Humphrey, in part because I think all of these painful compromises you have to make when your own allies in the civil rights movement say you're a sellout, that's, how you make progress. You have to do things like that. And people who are too pure to do that aren't going to make as much of a difference in the world. And so that's not a very direct answer to your question. But I guess it's my indirect answer to your question.
It's kind of ironic that it was Humphrey that kept Biden in the Senate after Biden's wife and children died.
Well, you who work for Humphrey then know something about this that I don't know, so tell us about that.
I don't know
know
that far, but the story is when Biden's family was killed, it was Humphrey who died in the car crash. It was Humphrey who came to him and just reassured him that there was a place for him in the Senate and he needed to stay. And he did.
You're telling me this for the first time.
Okay.
And this makes me even more upset that Biden didn't talk to me. So I really had this hope. That Biden would talk to me. And I wrote about Biden, and I spent months with Biden. This is back when he was vice president. So I thought, maybe he will, because he also tangled with Humphrey, Biden was, really on the conservative wing of what was then a very liberal Democratic Party. And on issues like busing, he was a Southerner. And so he and Humphrey had some real, battles royal during the few years when they overlapped. And I think Biden, now you may have given me a clue as to why it was Biden said, I thought he was just a blowhard, and I actually realized that I totally underestimated the guy. And maybe that's one reason why. Yeah.
So it sounds like that was a surprise to you just now?
Yes, it was!
Were there,
You only learn this stuff when it's too late!
were there any big surprises that, you found while working on the book?
Well, the one that I really enjoyed is that, because we think of Hubert as the nicest guy, and I thought of him as being such a nice guy. And when I went into the archives from way back in 1946, 47, 48, he was going to war with the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which he had put together for the Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party, because it was really in the grip of kind of pro-communist and sort of Stalinist figures. And they were going to fight a battle to the death. And Hubert was so much more brutal and bloody-minded than I would have thought. And he's writing letters to people saying, if you stab me in the back, I'm going to stab you in the chest. And he had his lieutenants writing to people they knew who were the editors of left-wing but anti-communist publications in New York, saying, we need to discredit this guy here in Minnesota. And we think he was once a member of the party. Can you dig up material on him? And so he was red-baiting these people. And, what that made me think is that Hubert would not do ugly things to advance his own personal ambition. When those moments arose, he didn't do it. But when he felt he was fighting on the side of the Lord, which he always felt he was doing, he would. So if it didn't seem personal, so Johnson would kill you to get to the next goodie for himself. Humphrey would never do that. But if he felt that you were standing in the way of justice, then he would. So I thought, good for him. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been great. Okay, so now I go and sign books?
Come right up to the front and
Okay.
we'll meet everybody at the front.
Okay.